If you guys have been following my channel for a bit, you know I'm usually pretty positive when I talk about Daggerfall. However, even for someone that's a huge fan of the game, there are some ideas that were implemented and some mechanics that I don't really love in it. In 2025, we're extremely fortunate to have the incredible Unity version of the game, though usually mods can take care of anything a player doesn't really enjoy. But even so, I thought it'd be fun to talk about a few things in Daggerfall that I personally don't like. But before we get started, if you enjoy content like this, consider subscribing or becoming a channel member through the link in the video description below. And with that out of the way, let's get into the video. The very first one might be at the top of my most disliked things in Daggerfall, and it's weapon material bonus to hit. I actually like a lot of the design choices surrounding the idea of weapon materials. It's fun to have weapons of different materials, it provides a simple vertical power structure, and I also like the idea of certain materials being necessary to damage certain enemies. But if you didn't know, weapon material also gives an absolutely huge bonus to hit. An iron dagger will give the player minus 10 to their hit modifier, and a Daedric dagger would give the player plus 60 to their hit modifier. This difference is so large that it nearly makes the weapon skill useless, and in my opinion really devalues the power that comes from the player's build. I really dislike this because I want the build of a character to play the most influential role on their ability to perform whatever task is related to that skill. The idea that the weapon material should play such a massive role in the success really strips the reliance on build, and allows really any character, even ones without the necessary skill, to perform well with those weapons. If I took a weapon skill like archery for example and placed it in even a minor skill slot or even no skill slot at all, and eventually in my playthrough acquired a Daedric bow, I would still perform pretty well with that bow, even if I never gained a single skill point in archery, because the material bonus is just that high. If I were to change this, I would keep it simple. A slight damage increase would already be sufficient enough to make weapons made of new materials valuable to the player, and the massive increase to hit, to me, is completely unnecessary and too powerful. So I'd remove any increase to hit and let the actual character's weapon skill shine for that aspect of combat, and just have a slight damage increase. This would also have the added benefit of making the bonus to hit from agility a more useful combat attribute, and make leveling your weapon skills a lot more important during a playthrough. I often mention in my videos how, in my opinion, sandbox RPGs shouldn't be too concerned with balancing. But in this video, when I say spell balance, I'm not talking about adjusting the power level of magic. The power level of magic is not what bothers me about spell design in Daggerfall. Part of what makes magic interesting in this game is it requires a lot more build commitment than a lot of other RPGs that I've played, and so the power level is part of that trade-off. What I mean by this is for almost any build that wants to cast spells, even if it's just supplemental spells for a primarily melee build, you need to invest in some combination of the 3 times int to spell points advantage, a huge amount of int, or need a very high skill in whichever magic school the spell is a part of. If the player doesn't have 2 or more of these things, then they'll basically only be able to cast a single spell or 2 before completely depleting their entire spell points pool for the majority of their playthrough. And if you wanted to approach Daggerfall with the role-playing idea that magic is very expensive in this world and you only get to cast 1 or 2 spells every rest, then I think that could be valid and a lot of fun. But from a build perspective, without 3 times magery, you need an extremely high skill in whichever magic school you want to cast in order to get a reasonable spell point cost, and this doesn't give room for a lot of build variety. In general, Daggerfall spells are strong, so it makes sense in some way, but it also really prevents feeling like you can dip a little bit into a single magic school for a build and become a specialist. For example, if I were making a paladin-style build in Daggerfall, I would likely want to grab Mysticism and Restoration as primary or major skill choices to match the flavor of the class fantasy. But in order to really cast any of these spells throughout the playthrough, I need to take the 3 times magery advantage, and it just feels that every build that wants to make any use of magic at all pretty much needs this advantage until reaching the late game. This feels off to me, especially when considering it was likely designed as an advantage that only dedicated casters would want. But spell costs are so high for so long in a playthrough that everyone needs this advantage. If even hybrid classes that only want some use of magic need the strongest increase in int to spell point advantage to function, then something really weird is going on with the balance of spell costs in the early to mid game. There are some exceptions to this, like a few of the restoration spells in my opinion have an appropriate spell point cost throughout the game, spells like free action or cure disease. But for most spells this is not the case. The way I would fix this is by focusing on more build options that allow for the specialization of a single magic school skill, similar to how martial builds have the expertise and advantage that can be selected for whichever weapon type they want to specialize in. Ideally, I would like to see this be done by creating some other trade-off, because in general, I do like that magic requires heavy investment, but I want building a hybrid to feel more substantially different than building a pure caster. If you want to play a caster that can cast every spell well, then I want that heavy investment to stay in Daggerfall, and it can stay exactly how it is now in my opinion. But for everyone else, I want specialization trade-offs. One idea I had was a new advantage that could be called something like, for example, Mysticism Attunement or Destruction Attunement. First, you choose Attunement, and then whichever magic skill you want to be attuned to. This advantage would allow for spells in whichever specific school you wanted to focus on to be cheaper for you to cast, but at the cost of either no longer having access to spells in other schools, or if that's too heavy of a trade-off, then maybe only being restricted from what is considered the opposite magic school. Now, for example, a Nightblade class that only wants to cast a few illusion spells can actually make use of those spells without building like a caster, but is also incapable of casting spells outside of that school or a designated opposite magic school. So if you grab Destruction Attunement, maybe the opposite magic school would be considered Restoration, and you can no longer cast spells from that school. This option would really be for people that want to specialize in a specific magic school. General mages and casters can still go the normal build route if they don't want to specialize, but now we would also have access to interesting new caster builds, which also allows for some interesting hybrid builds to be better realized and more functionally different. There's a lot more that can be done to expand on this idea, but I think this would be my ideal way of creating hybrid builds, by introducing advantages that allow for mastery of specific magic schools with the penalty of other magic school restrictions. And even just thinking about it makes me brainstorm some awesome builds that would be possible with this addition. Alright, I think I've talked enough about this, let's move on to the next one. Faction reputation doesn't really bother me that much, and I generally like how it's done in Daggerfall, but I think it could be a lot more interesting with just a few small adjustments. I'd like there to be more alternative ways to get faction reputation more consistently. At the moment, you really just need to spam faction quests to get faction reputation, which I think should be the main way to rise in the ranks of a faction, but I feel there's room for other creative ways as well. Temples in Daggerfall already kinda have something like this with the donation option, but donating to a temple doesn't increase your reputation with the faction, just the specific deity related to that temple, which is still a nice way to get some bonuses, but I'd like to see more ways to do this. For example, maybe you could farm a specific ingredient for the Mages Guild, and every time you turn 10 of it in, you gain 5 reputation. This would give the player an additional way to earn reputation in a more passive way over time, or it would give the player the option to target farm some ingredients if they're in the mood to just dungeon delve without questing, or happen to come across a dungeon that has enemies that drop one of the items they need for the reputation. Or another idea could be to donate stolen armor or weapons to the Spy Master of the Thieves Guild, as a way to share the loot from your thieving exploits with your fellow guildmates. Thematically, it would really fit the Thieves Guild vibe, and of course being generous in this way could reasonably result in a higher reputation. Or maybe the Fighters Guild could have a small tournament every month that has members of the guild sparring each other, with the winner getting a reward and of course some reputation with the faction. That one is likely a lot harder to implement into Daggerfall, but you get the idea. And that's just 3 examples that I thought of, but of course there could be a lot of different potential ideas on how to add alternative ways to gain reputation. I think this would provide a lot of variety to the game and would be a lot of fun. And that's 3 things I don't love in Daggerfall and how I'd change them. Are there any on my list that you agree with, and what would you change about Daggerfall? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching everyone, and I hope I'll see you in the next video. Take care.